I'd like to tell you a story of a 17-year-old girl. A girl who, like many 17-year-old girls, enjoys going out, talking about relationships, and finding ways to get around rules. Then one day, this girl experienced something she had never before, something she never really imagined experiencing. And she was raped by a friend of hers. So she was hanging out at this friend's house, and he wanted to have sex, and she didn't. She told him, and he said all right, but he didn't stop. He didn't stop touching her, he didn't stop kissing her, and she enjoyed listening to 90s rap, so he began to play that on the speaker to try and keep her awake. He continued to move his hands down her body, and she laid there wearing her turmeric-colored skirt she'd always wear out, and kept pushing his hands away, waiting for when he'd finally get it and stop. Eventually, they had sex. Well, she thought it was sex at first, until he was done, and she immediately started tearing up. And the reason why I'm here today is because that girl from the story is me. In fact, I was always aware that according to statistics, 1 in 3 of us have the same experience, but it never really stuck with me until it happened. So after it happened, I began texting my best friend, who at the time was in Germany. There was a message from her asking how my night was, and all I could really say was, "Not good, I'm not okay." I didn't really know how to phrase what had just happened, and I didn't know what words to use to try and explain the situation. But the more I talked to her, the more it made me realize a guy I had trusted had just raped me. So the week following that, I started telling people what happened. Like we always do, everyone was talking about their crazy weekend stories, and so I told them mine. I did say it quite casually because it wasn't something I cried over really. I initially did out of frustration, but after that, I was just confused and curious as to what was going on in his head. So when I told people, it was interesting because every single person had a different reaction. Most of my friends said, "Dude, that's not okay," or "Dude, you can't ever see him again." Then one of my friends said, "But you still did it, right?" And after I heard that a few times, I began thinking to myself, am I being dramatic, or am I just not being clear enough? But all of the responses had one thing in common, and it was that no one used the word rape. Was it because people were too afraid to use it because of how harsh and legit it sounds? Or was it because they were afraid of the way I would react to it? So I began to stay up for nights, writing everything down. My thoughts, reactions, trying to figure it all out. Wondering why he didn't listen, but also recognizing that I had empathy for him, because I knew he might have been unaware of what he did. So I came up with a goal, which is to look into how sex ed is taught and come up with a short sex ed program of my own, which I think fits our needs in Bali. So I began contacting the other schools around the island, CCS, BIS, and Diet Mika, to inquire about what they do for sex ed. And I went to these schools, and when I started talking to their counselors, I started getting messages from students around these schools saying they wanted to talk to me because they had stories to share. And when I contacted these schools, I initially didn't plan on collecting stories. But after I got my first message, I wanted to hear people's stories, and people wanted to be heard. And when I talked to these students, it was crazy because majority of the names of the perpetrators I heard were all people I knew, have heard of, or I'm pretty familiar with. And it was crazy how many stories there were. One person didn't just have one story, but one person had multiple stories to share. And often the people I talked to pushed their stories away and kept their stories quiet because they didn't know how to react. And just like me, there's an initial feeling of confusion, self-blame, and for some reason wanting to protect the perpetrator. And so I got involved with the grade 11 sex ed class here in Greenstone. And one of the lessons I taught alongside Ibu Harriet was called Consent, Coercion, and Force. Coercion meaning being insistent, manipulating, or persuading someone into doing something, and coerced consent, which means consenting only because of insistence and because it was forced upon you to say okay. So we talked about the gray areas between the three, consent, coercion, and force, as well as what it looks like in real-world situations. We considered these real-world hypothetical situations to better understand how we find our way in these gray areas and to better understand what we know or think we know about what's okay and what's not okay when it comes to giving consent. And it was amazing to see how few people truly understood the meaning of these words and actions, especially the word coercion, which is one that comes up so often. And around the same time, one of the most significant days this year for me was V-Day, where I facilitated a few workshops with Ibu Harriet, and after every single one of them, someone came up to me and said, "Hey, that made me realize something," or "I need to tell you something." And I was mostly hearing stories from students in other schools, but now it was people in Green School that I see every single day, and they all had stories to share as well. V-Day was so incredibly overwhelming and gratifying at the same time, because one story led to another, and it just kept going. And every step I took afterwards was impacted by the moment I didn't have a choice. But instead of feeling like something had been taken from me, I felt like I was given. And instead of feeling the powerlessness I thought I would, I felt so much more power. And I had this feeling of urgency, that I needed to at least try and fulfill the needs of every single person that's been in the same position as me. But in order to do that, I wanted to hear the other side of the story. I wanted to hear his story. I wanted him to know how much of an impact he's had on my life. And I'd ignored him for a few months, and even though I was so incredibly nervous to the way he might react, I decided to see him. So after figuring out what I wanted to say to him, I texted him and asked him if he wanted to go grab some food. A few days later, there we were, sitting at a table, looking out at the Bali traffic, eating our fries and burgers, and I began to tell him my side of the story. I was recapping the night from my perspective, and I told him how I felt, how it felt for me, and told him that I define it as rape, which is sexual activity without the consent of the victim, and is dominating something that isn't yours. He apologized he didn't see it from my perspective, and I asked him why he didn't stop when I kept on telling him to stop. And what he said was, "I thought you were saying it in a playful way." And so I continued to question him, only to figure out what was going on in his head, and I wanted him to know what was going on in mine. I asked him to define rape for me, and what he said was, he said he thought it was when someone is physically abused, kind of just like the movies. I said, "Well, everything's not like the movies. You didn't physically abuse me, and around 90% of perpetrators are people you know." And when I did question him, he would just stare back out at the traffic and would make no eye contact and didn't really reply. And I knew I was making him feel uncomfortable, but I didn't want him to feel attacked. I wanted him to be aware, because I could see where he was coming from. I know what his upbringing is like. I know how he acts and talks in social situations and with his friends. And I don't blame him, and I still don't. I never blamed him, and I still don't. But the reality of life is that people are responsible for their own actions. But we have collectively failed to teach each other what respect really means in words and actions. And how do we learn to respect one another's boundaries? Yes, the individual has to be responsible for their actions, but the leverage for change is within culture, education, and the way we socialize. I told him it isn't just him. I told him about multiple situations I've been in where I felt uncomfortable and angry because of the way women were being talked about and being objectified. So I began to tell him a story, how I was once at a friend's house, and we were a group of people sitting downstairs, and there was one girl who I had brought home with me because she was passed out drunk. She was sleeping in a room upstairs, and one of the guys downstairs had never had sex before. So another guy starts talking to him about how he should go sleep with that girl, knowing very well that she was unconscious. I continued to tell him similar stories, and what he said to me at the end was, "Well, that's just how it is in Bali." So why is it like this? Rape culture is real all over the world, but it's different everywhere you go. And there's a different one I've experienced here in Bali, one that I can't quite seem to explain to adults because they're not living it. But when I talk to students, most of them understand exactly what I'm trying to say. Within 3 months of sharing my story, I had heard around 60 stories, whether they were written or spoken, all from people on the island. So what kind of mindset leads to such issues? The music we listen to, social groups, the words we use, and there isn't much authority in Bali either. We have lots of freedom. We don't have people telling us what to do and what not to do. And if we speak up, for some people it means being that one annoying person in the group. So we don't speak up because we're afraid of judgment. We're all bystanders. Not fitting in Not giving into that culture means not fitting in, and this is dominating us right now. Upholding a reputation and keeping up a social status. But also our minds have been filtered. We don't realize how impactful the words coming out of our mouths are, and I myself can say that my views have changed a lot after I had these experiences. I started viewing my generation's culture differently. I started comparing students in different learning environments. I started viewing party and hookup culture differently. And I started thinking about the times I gave into rape culture. But this culture is instilled in our minds and instilled in those minds who know no less than to absorb the mindsets of those around them. Rape culture is so heavily ingrained in our society. Is it possible to change? We still live in a society that teaches don't get raped instead of don't rape. So where does the responsibility lie? I've been asked many times why I couldn't defend myself. Been told so many times that's just how it is here. Everyone's like that, and yeah, but that always happens. This is rape culture, and we normalize coercion. Why isn't it yet understood that once you say no, you don't need to be asked why? In order to change, we have to start from the beginning. Start teaching about respecting each other from the start. We need to add to what we already teach in sex ed, because the anatomy of genitals has nothing to do with social intelligence, nor does how you go about pleasuring yourself with complete ignorance towards the other person involved. People have stories that are begging to be heard, and we really are making a difference through sharing and listening. So let's keep sharing. But to the parents in the room, you have so much power to influence positive change. Up to you how you teach your child to respect others. But we also have to look at it from the other side and teach to accept rejection, that it should be okay for someone to turn you down. All we can do is spread the right idea. And can Green School take a lead on discussing these issues? Sexual education isn't just about puberty, anatomy, and sex, but everything that comes with it. It's about being an ally, being a sentient being, so knowing what it means to feel. Mental health, brain development, love, laws, what consent really means in social situations, and the list goes on. We don't have a common understanding of these topics yet, which is what we need in order to face these issues. And along with that come stories, and these stories are my fuel and the reason why I've been so motivated to work on this project. But they've also made me realize that we need to focus on social and emotional well-being, knowing how to help others when needed, and self-care. We know rape and sexual assault happens. As a community, we talk about it, but what happens after that? We need to acknowledge that people have their own way of processing, that it's different for everyone, and we need to take care of each other. And I went through a self-care journey of my own, figuring out my own ways to process all the information I was getting. And one of my teachers, who I've been working really closely with, Ibu Mary, told me two things. Everyone wants to be heard and everyone wants to be loved. And I started noticing that wherever I went, my story would be with me. And once I began to speak, people started sharing their stories with me. And that was the most amazing feeling, knowing that that space was being created. Everyone has a story, and we just haven't heard it yet. So let's listen, let's take care of each other, and let's talk about rape. Thank you.